In the north of Roman Britain, the frontier was not only a line of stone facing outward into wind and distance. It was also a place of lists, wages, boots drying by the hearth, letters folded small, and families waiting through wet northern seasons. Along Hadrian's wall, in forts and roadside settlements, empire became ordinary. Its grand power narrowed into bread, leather, ink, and the measured habits of a working day. In AD 122, when the Emperor Hadrian came to Britain, the great frontier in the north began to take a more deliberate shape across what is now northern England. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to imagine a single hard line drawn against danger. Yet the wall was something quieter and more administrative, as well as defensive. A managed border of stone curtain wall, mile castles, turrets, forts, roads and gates, arranged to observe movement, channel traffic, and divide space into what was permitted and what was not. Along this line, the empire expressed itself not only through force, but through measurement, masonry, and routine. Further south, at Vindolanda, just below the wall itself, some of the clearest traces of that routine survived by rare good fortune. There, waterlogged ground sealed away thin wooden writing tablets, scraps of leather, and other fragile things that usually disappear, so that the frontier reaches us not only in ruined stone, but in handwriting, worn shoes, and the texture of ordinary use. The forts along the line were, in effect, small planned towns in uniform. Inside their walls stood headquarters buildings, granaries raised to keep stores dry, barracks, workshops, bathhouses, and rooms for equipment and provisions, all laid out with a practical Roman regularity. Outside, very often, grew a civilian settlement, the vicus, where traders, smiths, potters, laborers, partners, and children lived in the fort's shadow and in its economy. The garrisons themselves belonged to a world much wider than Britain. Most were auxiliary troops, recruited from many provinces of the empire, rather than from local Britons alone, and so this damp frontier became a place where men from Syria, Gaul, Batavia, and elsewhere served under the same gray sky, carrying habits, languages, and gods from far warmer or flatter landscapes. A frontier can seem remote on a map, yet in such places the empire was densely gathered. Beneath the martial appearance, there was also a clerical texture. Soldiers received regular stipendium, but deductions were often made for food, clothing, and equipment, and money might be held within regimental accounts, as if service were conducted partly through ledgers as much as through drill. The buildings and tablets together suggest the shape of an ordinary week. Watches kept at gates and towers, training on open ground, repairs to roads and ramparts, wagons needing axles checked, leather cut for shoes, walls plastered, patients treated, stores counted, messages copied and sent, bathhouses steamed, granaries filled and emptied, and the labor of maintenance quietly occupied more hours than battle. In the years that followed, the wall became less a fresh imperial statement than a lived landscape, its stone edges weathering into the local seasons, while roads carried supply carts, orders, gossip, and the long-repeated business of feeding, housing, and paying an army at the edge of Rome. If the wall's stone face gives Roman Britain its outline, the handwriting from Vindolanda gives it a voice. In the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, thin wooden tablets, inked in a quick cursive hand and thrown into the damp ground, preserved the traffic of an occupied place with remarkable tenderness. There are duty reports and requests, lists and memoranda, routine notes that once moved across desks and between forts almost without ceremony, and yet now make the frontier sound unexpectedly close. One famous tablet, sent around AD 100, carries an invitation from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, asking her to come to a birthday celebration. The note is warm, careful, and social, and because it survives partly in a woman's own hand, it gently restores to the northern frontier the presence of officers' wives, servants, children, and the domestic households that lived within the orbit of military command. Set beside that intimate message are more workmanlike records, mentioning wheat, hides and sinews, the plain vocabulary of a fort that was also a receiving station in a wide imperial supply system. Paperwork followed food and raw materials with patient regularity, as if administration itself were one of the wall's most enduring building materials. The tablets also mention clothing, including undergarments, and the waterlogged soil at Vindolanda has yielded hundreds of leather shoes and boots, preserved in a condition rare for the Roman world. Some are heavy military shoes, broad and studded for marching. Others are lighter, smaller, shaped for women or children. Together, they suggest not only who was present, but what the ground was like underfoot. Mud at gateways, wet tracks between buildings, leather repeatedly repaired and repeatedly worn down by the long northern weather. In the same quiet way, food appears through the archaeology less as a feast than as a system. Grain for bread was fundamental, and beef seems to have been especially important in military provisioning. Quern stones, storage buildings, and the spread of animal bones from wall forts and Vindolanda point to an army that had to keep thousands fed through winter and rain, through ordinary weeks when nothing much happened except that supplies had to arrive on time. Beyond the fort gates, the vicus extended this rhythm into civilian life. Merchants, craftspeople, and suppliers gathered where soldiers needed shoes, meat, ale, timber, carts, and small repairs, and military demand sustained a chain of service communities along Rome's edge. In that landscape, the frontier could feel less like a lonely line against the north than like a string of inhabited places, held together by pay, paperwork, and the steady wearing out of useful things. In the years that followed, and into the 3rd century, the frontier settled further into the habits of an empire that preferred records to improvisation. Under Septimius Severus, military pay was increased, and soldiers' family lives were more openly acknowledged in law and practice, giving formal shape to arrangements that the archaeology around the forts had long implied already existed. Wives, partners, children, traders, and dependents had never been entirely absent from this landscape of walls and ditches. They had been there in the worn paths to the vicus, in small shoes, hairpins, spindle whorls, and scraps of domestic refuse. By this point, the wall was sustained less by novelty than by repetition. Grain was counted into stores, duties assigned and reassigned, animals slaughtered and portioned out, letters dispatched along wet roads, sandals patched, bathhouses heated against the cold, and in the headquarters, buildings' accounts were kept beneath the standards, with the same patient regularity as in places far from Britain. Its purpose remained military, and administrative control was never far away. Gates could be shut, movement watched, taxes and supplies enforced, and men directed where the state required them. Yet much of what survives is domestic in scale. and that is why the frontier now feels so recognizably human. Rome is visible here, not only in masonry and command, but in a writing tablet, a child's object, a broken comb, a leather offcut dropped beside a workshop floor. At Hadrian's Wall, the empire can seem, almost above all, a habit of listing, storing, issuing, and mending, a vast power translated into cupboards, bins, tallying, and ink. Toward the end of Roman rule in Britain in the early 5th century, that formal system thinned and then receded. Forts were altered to meet local needs, some spaces abandoned, others reused in smaller and less uniform ways, as the dependable flow of pay, orders, and provisioning ebbed. The great frontier did not vanish in a single moment. It passed gradually out of military use and into another life, as a line of stone weathering into pasture, a source of building material, a landmark folded into local memory. In the long centuries that followed, ruin itself became part of the wall's history. Modern excavation, especially from the 1970s onward at Vindolanda, brought that quieter history back into view with unusual intimacy. Tablets lifted from damp soil, leather shoes preserved in astonishing numbers, tools, fragments of clothing, and ordinary household things changed the meaning of the frontier. Hadrian's Wall was no longer only a story of stone, distance, and strategy, but of voices, meals, errands, damp winters, and the weathered routine of people who expected tomorrow to resemble today. Its legacy now is as one of the clearest places in Britain to see how Rome functioned in daily life, through clerks and quartermasters, wives and children, cobblers and pack animals, and the steady scratching of ink across a wooden tablet. What remains of Hadrian's Wall is often read as a boundary, yet its most human traces are smaller and quieter. A child's shoe, a birthday invitation, a note about grain, a soldier's pay. In these fragments, Rome's farthest edge still feels inhabited, not by legend alone, but by routine.